Hi, parents. Elizabeth Porch here. I am starting the reading of An Introduction to Classical Education, a guide for parents by Christopher Perrin. This will be part one. It's going to be in 3 parts. This is not going to be a professional reading. I will make mistakes, but just imagine me sitting there reading aloud to you, and it'll be great. As the former headmaster of a classical school, I have often spoken with parents who are both interested in and puzzled about classical education. How does the classical approach differ from that which is offered in public schools? Are there any other schools doing what you are doing? How do classically educated students perform on standardized tests? After several decades, the questions are predictable, but wholly justified. Unfortunately for me, even my answers are now predictable, which is one reason I am writing this guide. If you will read this before you talk to me, or someone like me, you can spare both of us my stock replies. Secondly, if I put my answers down in writing, I am bound to say something new. If you are like most, you have probably heard about classical education by means of a friend who either has a child enrolled in a classical school or is homeschooling classically. You are doing your research and are interested enough to do some reading about classical education. If you have visited a classical school or co-op, you may have seen a few classes in operation which have raised eyebrows, interests, and many more questions. In any case, you have questions, and a good many of you will have put those questions down in writing. I wish to commend you for your questions, for your thinking. To come up with hard-boiled questions is something that, as you shall see, is quite classical. Classical education is a long tradition of asking questions and digging up answers, consulting others, then asking, seeking, and finding once more. It is joining, as one writer puts it, the great conversation. That means reading great books, the classics, studying them, mining them, and talking to others about the influential ideas that they contain. Whatever else classical education is, it is an ongoing series of questions and answers. So you see why I'm glad you come asking about all manner of things besides the yearly tuition. Modern confusion, ancient clarity. It is a tumultuous time to be living. Institutions, information, customs, mores, and standards are changing rapidly. Choices and options have multiplied. Our culture is becoming increasingly kaleidoscopic. Such colorful and rapid changes does have its dramatic elements, and some find it quite entertaining. However, constant change and novelty can themselves grow old, becoming what Thomas Oden calls the cheap promise of radical newness, which is the most boring and repetition of all modern ideas. Many of us are ready to leave the party, go home, and have a cup of tea in a quiet chair. As we contemplate raising and educating our children, many of us have been forced to ask ourselves what we wish to pass on to our children. How do we nurture them in the middle of this confusion, doubt, and conflict of the modern world? Is there any place of rest and refuge, any place of tranquility and strength? Education is the vast undertaking of passing on the wisdom and knowledge of one generation to another. It involves discovery, but also instruction. It is cultural transmission. With our present culture undergoing so much flux, it is no surprise to find that education is in a state of tumult as too. For the parent looking for a school to aid in this task of cultural transmission, it is often a bewildering affair. Those of us in classical education are taking our cues from a time before the party began. Our experiences are all similar. We have not found the wholesome food we need in the present. We have been entertained, but not fed, amused, but not instructed. We have gone, therefore, to another place, not too far off, but still forgotten by most. We have gone back to the well-walked path of the tried and proven, the classical method of education. It has never really disappeared. It just became quite fragmented and diffused, with parts like ruins in modern schools and colleges. It was eclipsed as the reigning model only about 100 years ago after reigning for over 1,000. Your grandparents are likely to have received something of a classical education. G.K. Chesterton said that every revolution is a restoration, the recapturing and reintroduction of something that once guided and inspired people in the past. The word revolution is from the Latin word revolvere, to re-roll or to return. A revolution is that thing which, going around, comes around again. In a similar vein, C.S. Lewis says that when we have lost our way, the quickest way forward is usually to go home. So we are returning, we are revolvering. To put it strongly, we are revolting, and we are doing it by going home. A brief history of classical education, sketch and overview. I hope you will find it refreshing to discover that the method of classical education is simple yet profound, like so many great ideas from the wheel to the umbrella. Its basic philosophy is to teach children in the ways they naturally want to be taught, despite not always knowing it. Put another way, classical educators teach children what they want to know when they want to know it. When children are astonished with the human tongue, we teach them language and grammar. When children are ready to challenge every assumption, we teach them logic. When students are yearning to express themselves with passion, we teach them rhetoric. To be sure, children did not discover this means of education on their own. Rather, it appears that it was parents who discovered it, and the children merely ratified it. The phrase classical and classical education beg for some definition. In history, the classical period refers to the civilizations of the Greeks and Romans, 600 BC to 476 AD, who have bequeathed to us classical myth, art, and architecture, and the classical languages of Greek and Latin. Certainly, the education practiced by the Greeks and Romans can be called classical education. Classical education, therefore, can mean the educational methods of the Greeks and Romans. However, the word classical or classic cannot be restricted to the classical period per se. We also use the term to describe things that are authoritative, traditional, and enduring. Classical literature, for example, can be any work, not just Greek or Roman literature, of enduring excellence. Therefore, we can use the phrase classical education to refer not just to the educational practices of the Greeks and Romans, but also to authoritative, traditional, enduring, and excellent education. I use the phrase with both of these connotations in mind. Classical education is the authoritative, traditional, and enduring form of education, begun by the Greeks and Romans, developed through history, and now being renewed and recovered in the 21st century. With this general definition in mind, we can now sketch an outline of the history of classical education. After this initial brief sketch, we will come back and paint in some additional detail. Classical education is old, which is why it now appears so new. It was new with the Greeks and Romans over 2,000 years ago. They are credited with constructing the rudiments of the classical approach to education. We would be misled to think that the Greeks and Romans educated in simple and consistent ways, for there is a good deal of variety in the curriculum and approach of both the Greeks and the Romans. After all, nearly 1,000 years encompass the periods of these two civilizations. Still, there are common themes that run through the educational practices of both groups, including a generally sustained emphasis on the study of grammar, literature, logic, and rhetoric. It was later, during the Middle Ages, 8500 to 1460, that the great variety of subjects and approaches present in the Greek and Romans was analyzed and put into a systematic and more consistent form and curriculum. The curriculum of the trivium, meaning 3 ways, featuring the subject of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, was formally established during this time, as well as its counterpart, the quadrivium, the 4 ways, containing the subjects of astronomy, arithmetic, music, and geometry. The word trivium and quadrivium were coined in the Middle Ages, not during the period of the Greeks and Romans. I find it helpful to refer to one form of the classical education as trivium-based education, the kind of classical education being recovered in many K-12 schools and homeschools in North America. It is important to emphasize that classical education has evolved. It has evolved with some sustained themes and patterns, but not without significant variation. The Middle Ages cannot be reduced to simple educational cliches. It was too varied, despite its penchant for classification and order. In the late Middle Ages, learning began to ebb, the so-called Dark Ages, setting up the need for the Renaissance in 1350 and 1600, which was, among other things, a cry to return to the learning of the past, to go ad fontes, back to the fountain. The Reformation in 1517 to 1700 was a complex movement of spiritual reawakening, but it also contained this element of returning to the ancient fountains of wisdom, with a special emphasis on returning to the authority and teachings of Scripture. The reformers retained the interest in studying classical languages and literature revived by the Renaissance. The great reformers were themselves learned, classically educated men. The next major movement was the Enlightenment, 1700s to 1789, which marked a departure from the authority of Scripture and the Church to an allegiance instead to the power of man's native intellect. Science, with its varied subjects, came into its own, and while most scientists were also Christians or theists, there was an increasing tendency to study and understand the world without reference to biblical teaching or authority. Still, however, most forms of education retain the rudiments of the trivium and the quadrivium. Our founding fathers, for example, were all reared in the Enlightenment period, but bear the marks of classically trained in literature, classical languages, especially Latin, history, and rhetoric. It really is not until the modern period, beginning in the early 1800s, that we begin to see the first signs of erosion of classical education. But even then, we note that this erosion was a slow, gradual process, and throughout the 1800s, classical education was still the dominant approach in the United States and Europe. Through the early 1900s, however, the erosion quickened, and by 1950, the educational landscape of the United States had clearly shifted from a classical to a progressive model. It is this progressive form of education that we have all received, making our knowledge and awareness of classical education limited. It is our progressive education that makes us think of the classical approach as foreign or novel, even though the classical model has reigned for centuries, and the progressive model is the novelty. So there has been a variation and change, and in the 1900s a notable atrophy. The subjects of grammar, logic, and rhetoric do continue as themes throughout the history of classical education, even though they have ebbed and flowed and been taught in different ways and sequences. Classical methods of education have also continued, which we will consider later in this text. Even after the ascendancy of progressive education, the fragments of classical education persist, even in progressive schools. The scattered stones of classical education are present in contemporary schools and can still be seen by a trained eye. Recovering classical education is a matter of gathering those stones and repairing the ruins. Painting in the sketch. Now that we have sketched the outline of classical education, let's retrace this outline and paint in some important details. The Greeks did come first. Precisely because they did come first, they are immortalized as important founders of Western culture and civilization. How it is that they emerged as potent cultural and civilization is its own mysterious and fascinating story, which we cannot explore here. The Greeks have given to us the first enduring forms of democracy, embodied in the Greek city-state, or polis, and great treasuries of art and literature. Their educational system did evolve and change, but it consistently emphasized the importance of arete, or individual excellence and achievement. Physical excellence and ability was just as important, if not more, than intellectual excellence. Greek children from age 7 to 14 attended both a palastrae, where they learned to wrestle, and a music school, where they learned reading, recitation, writing, and arithmetic, as well as how to play the lyre and to sing. Music, to the Greeks, had a much wider meaning than music as it is used today. From age 10 to 14, students would continue with their physical training at a gymnasium, where they studied wrestling, boxing, running, and the long jump, and throwing the discus and javelin. These skills had an obvious connection to military training and soldiery. From age 15 to 18, some privileged male students would continue their education by observing and participating in Greek cultural and civic life, being trained and mentored by the adult Greek citizen. Finally, some young men from age 18 to 20 would undergo 2 years of military training that would prepare them to serve as capable military officers and soldiers. This general sequence and very basic curriculum was enhanced and changed as the Greek civilization grew. Important Greek educators, the sophists and the philosophers, emerged who argued for various ways of educating Greek youth. Some advocated training for political success and viewed man as the measure or standard of all things. Some advocated a dedicated study of rhetoric that would enable practical political success, not just for personal ambition, but for the good of the Greek city-state. Still others, like Plato, following his mentor Socrates, argued for the dedicated study of philosophy instead of rhetoric, which he believed would lead men to discover truth, goodness, and justice, which enabled students to learn how to reason correctly and detect and refute false reasoning. Aristotle, who succeeded Plato, argued for the study of both dialectic and rhetoric. Ultimately, the Greeks passed down their concept of paideia, their view that man is to be crafted like a work of art by a standard of excellence. As such, education is the making of a man, not the training of a man to do things. This conception persists today in our idea of the well-rounded, liberally educated man. The Romans conquered the Greeks in 153 BC, yet found themselves conquered culturally by their Greek captives. The Romans greatly admired and emulated Greek art, architecture, literature, and education. While the Romans did have some of their own educational emphasis, such as a commitment to agricultural and military training, they imported the educational subjects, goals, and methods of the Greeks. Thus, while the subjects of grammar, logic, and rhetoric got their start with the Greeks, they continued to thrive under the Romans. Like the Greeks, the Romans started formal education at the age of 7. Students began their studies with a literator, who taught them letters or how to read. After learning how to read, in Greek, Latin, or both, the students moved up to grammaticus, who, in a school setting, taught them not just grammar, the structure, form, and syntax of language, but also literature, particularly poetry. Through the study of literature, students also learned history, ethics, and politics. They also did a number of writing exercises that prepared them for rhetoric. Greek students studied Homer, the Iliad, and the Odyssey, who was the model for excellent language, virtue, and wisdom. The Romans eventually studied the Latin writer Virgil in the Aeneid, who was the Latin equivalent of Homer. Sometimes students did not study with a dialectic teacher per se, and some students did not study dialectic or logic at all. Often the grammaticus would teach students some rhetoric near the end of their secondary study, and usually this would end a student's formal course of study. Dialectic logic emerged as a field of study for the Greeks, who thought it complemented a student's rhetorical abilities. If a student wished to pursue a political or legal career, he would certainly go on for training in rhetoric, since rhetoric aimed to train students to speak eloquently and persuasively, skills needed both in the assembly and in the courts. The trivium subjects of grammar, logic, and rhetoric did persist through both the Greek and Roman periods, but in various sequences and patterns. These 3 subjects were very useful for increasing skills in the use of language, and so are often called verbal arts. With the advent of the Middle Ages, 4 quantitative arts were ratified and added to the curriculum: geometry, astronomy, music, and arithmetic. Geometry included some rudiments of geography, astronomy, including some physics, grammar, including literature, and rhetoric, including history. These 4 quantitative arts were known as the quadrivium, the 4 ways. And the 7 arts together became known as artes liberales, or several liberal arts. A liberal arts college, one might think, would emphasize these 7 subjects. Don't be so sure. These liberal arts were thought to be the art or skills of the free man in the arts, which would provide freedom to those who studied them. After the formalization of these several liberal arts in the Middle Ages, a new sequence, though with some variety of study, evolved. The first 3 arts, the trivium, were studied first, though rhetoric was often studied later and long, and generally followed by the quadrivium. I hope the diagram on the next page is helpful. Greek and Roman elements of education, therefore, were collected, categorized, and formalized during the Middle Ages. Put another way, the classical education model inherited from the Greek and the Romans was modified and updated. It was during this time that the terminology of the trivium and the quadrivium was coined, as well as artes liberales. Almost universally, Christians adopted the classical model and invested it with the theological assumptions and guidelines that were intended to serve the church. The study of theology was added to the 7 liberal arts as the crowning discipline, or queen of the sciences. Christians even continued to study the non-Christian classical authors of the past with reverence and respect, using authors like Aristotle to help create a system of Christian theology. Example, Thomas Aquinas. It was also during the Middle Ages that a more straightforward and discrete sequence of subjects evolved. Thus, it is from the medieval trivium, inherited and modified by the Romans, that we derive much of our structure, inspiration, and guidance in our present efforts at recovery, and why I like the phrase trivium-based education. It was during the Middle Ages that we witnessed the rise of the university, where the quadrivium subjects really came into their own as an institutional atmosphere, and where law and medicine first became courses of study. The trivium subjects, especially grammar, continued to be taught by private teachers, tutors, in cathedral schools and monasteries. Logic and rhetoric were often taught at the university level, along with the quadrivium subjects. Cathedral schools were church schools that were attached to cathedrals, where students were often sent to receive their education, usually for free. Monastic schools offered education to boys who committed themselves to become monks, but also to the poor of the community as the monastery was able. Many of the great minds of the Middle Ages were monks who were educated in monasteries. As we saw in our initial sketch, classical education continued to develop through the Renaissance and Reformation. Both movements represented a return to the learning of the past, particularly the study of Greek and Roman authors in their original languages of Greek and Latin. During these periods, scholars searched for and found many ancient manuscripts of Greek and Roman authors. The study of Greek was revived, very pertinent to the study of the New Testament, after having abated during the Middle Ages. Latin study, which had never ceased, increased. Not surprisingly, in their enthusiasm for these ancient authors, many writers began to imitate the masters that they had rediscovered. Reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin started schools that emphasized classical subjects and learning. Luther, for example, doubted the value of certain pagan authors like Aristotle, especially his works on ethics, but still urged students to study Aristotle's books on rhetoric and poetics. While stating his preference for school curriculum, Luther says this about the study of classical languages in 1520. Quote, "In addition, there are, of course, the Latin, Greek, and Hebrew languages, as well as the mathematical disciplines and history," end quote. Luther assumes, as a matter of course, that students will be studying not only Latin and Greek, but also Hebrew, the original language of the Old Testament. The Reformers emphasized the importance of creating literate, educated church that could read and study the scriptures in the original languages. As inheritors of the classical tradition of education, they took it for granted that students should study an ample amount of history and literature, even if the pagan variety. We see as well the commitment to the quantitative arts. Luther mentions mathematics that compose the liberally educated man or woman. As we touch once more upon the Enlightenment period, it will be sufficient to note that while the religious motive and orientation of education did begin to shift to a naturalistic viewpoint, it is still true that 1. A Christian orientation and motive still continued and in some places increased, and 2. The classical subjects and methodology continued and were adopted by non-Christian theorists and educators. During the Enlightenment, for example, universities came into their own and began to flourish and multiply throughout Europe and then North America. The curricula of these universities were clearly classical and linked to the classical tradition which they inherited. Experiment, change, and modification to the classical tradition did begin, especially with the advent of scientific experimentation, but was in no way abandoned. Up until the early 1900s, various forms of classical education were the norm for the United States and Europe. The curriculum of Harvard, for example, was non-elective. There were no majors required for all students until 1884. A record of Harvard's curriculum in 1830 reveals it to be nothing but a classical curriculum in clear connection with the trivium and the quadrivium. Great minds and writers up to this time were all educated classically. People like Abraham Lincoln, Oliver Wendell, Holmes, and even early 20th century writers like William Jennings, Bryant, and G.K. Chesterton. People in the generation of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien were some of the last to have been educated classically among the British. Certainly, the earlier generations of the American founders were classically educated. Their knowledge of classical language, literature, and history is widely acknowledged by historians and played a fundamental part in shaping the American Constitution and political philosophy. A cursory reading of the Federalist Papers proves this point. Writers like James Madison, John Hay, Alexander Hamilton, and Thomas Jefferson quote Latin phrases, refer to political precedents and lessons from Greek, Roman, and European history, and write with an elegance and style that astonishes us today. How, therefore, can such a long tradition of education seem so novel today at the beginning of the 21st century? Well, it only takes one generation to stop the transmission of the past. And education is precisely a matter of passing along what was given to us. Or as Chesterton put it, education is simply the soul of a society as it passes from one generation to another. The move away from classical education began in the mid-1800s with the thinking of men like Horace Mann, a Massachusetts educator who worked tirelessly for modernizing public education and was consolidated by later thinkers like John Dewey, who advocated a kind of progressive education that emphasized learning by doing and rejected many traditional methods like memorization and classical language study. Dewey and the progressive educators emphasized the need to train citizens for the growing industrialized American democracy. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, various forms of progressive education began to take shape and gradually supplanted the classical model. It is true that the classical model never completely disappeared, and its remnants remain in many places. Example, the name grammar school. But by the 1950s, these progressive forms of education became dominant. Most of us, therefore, grew up under the teachings of progressive educators who believed they were ushering in a superior method of teaching and preparing students for life in the modern, quickly changing, post-war world. A few examples of the progressive approach should ring familiar. Classical languages were dropped altogether and relegated to shrinking classics departments in colleges. Basic instruction in phonics and decoding was replaced with a whole language approach of reading instruction. Training in logic and dialectic was replaced with self-expression without fault-finding. Writing instruction, guided by imitating the masters and frequent practice, was replaced with more individualistic, creative approaches and less practice. Math instruction steeped in drill, practice, and repetition was replaced with curricula containing less drill and practice and more activities and stories related to the subject. History instruction grounded in and celebrating the Western tradition from which the United States emerged was gradually replaced with multicultural approaches that downplayed European and even American history and presented instead a smattering of world history, your old social study classes. Furthermore, progressive educators often looked back on the classical model as harsh, cold, and unpleasant for students. As a result, progressive educators strove to be entertaining and fun, and gradually began to expect less of students in terms of work and achievements. Standards of student behavior also began to change, and schools became more permissive and less willing to discipline for misbehavior. Grading, too, became more lenient in an effort to boost student self-esteem. In the last 20 years, this progressive movement has continued to play out with some new twists. Philosophical relativism, no universal truths or moral standards, now reigns without rival in popular culture and in education. Its close cousin, philosophical skepticism, nothing can be known with certainty, also maintains a strong presence. As a result, we have seen increasing antagonism from any viewpoint that challenges this modern orthodoxy by daring to declare that any one fact or ethic is actually true or normative. Early programs like values clarification have continued and multiplied, programs which assume and teach moral relativism. The only real sin in many modern schools is to disagree with the notion that everyone determines his own truth and his own morality. As you can imagine and probably know, Christians and their viewpoints, creation, fall, redemption, are not generally appreciated, unless, of course, they keep silent and just follow along. This relativism has given rise to egalitarianism, that doctrine that no one can really be superior to anyone else, which makes sense when there are no universal standards. Egalitarianism, in turn, has resulted in grade inflation, the lowering of academic standards, so everyone can get an A, and a hesitancy to recognize outstanding achievement. Parental authority, too, has ebbed considerably. In many public schools, parents are not welcome to observe a class under any circumstances. The effects of modern education will vary somewhat from region to region and school to school. Nonetheless, it is still possible to generalize about the widespread effects that are observed around the nation. It is also true that modern education research and methods sometimes make useful discoveries and contributions. It is true as well that some educators are returning to traditional methods after continued frustration with educational innovation. Direct instruction, the core curriculum of E.D. Hirsch, author of Cultural Literacy, the traditional and virtual charter school models of William Bennett, the Paideia Project of Mortimer Adler, various independent learning centers, and the rise of independent phonics programs, and even a renewed interest in Latin study are all evidence of a return to traditional values. Some modern educators, therefore, are surprisingly open to classical education, and some are stumbling upon it without really knowing it, recalling these lines of T.S. Eliot. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. The modern experiment in education, therefore, is about 100 years old and flagging. The classical experiment is about 1,000 years old and reviving.